there's a principle in quantum physics that was articulated so nicely by David Bohm, that no cause is local. And so, we, in our material perspective, we consider that. Well, what could that possibly mean? Is something in St. Louis or Kansas City or Nairobi or Moscow the cause of something here? Well, they may be interrelated in some way, but that's not what that means. It's that in the inner dimensions there's implicate orders, as Bohm put it, inner dimensions of reality that outpicture to make this one. So we have a thought, say, to go shopping, and we have a vision of that. And so after a while we end up in the market. So in other words, the cause of being in that market, being in the market is local. Our thought about going to the market or desire to be there was non-local, in that it's in a implicate or inner dimension. So we have this physical reality that's unfolding to this one. So from this perspective, you know, there is a linearness to causality we see in physicalness, like there is something that goes from point A to point B. But then there's something deeper that unfolds both point A and B. So it's that kind of perspective. So there's this inner consciousness. So there's, in the developing of our sense of who we are, there's this reflection back from life. This challenge comes up, this person's requiring this. So as we grow up in that, we keep formulating this ego or this self-sense based on that reflection back. But what we miss is where there's inner drives, there's inner things going on that motivate us or have this interest or that aptitude, and so we don't look at that so much. However, what's occurring is that what we decide from what is reflected back to us starts being internalized. And so we have this internal representation of the outer reality based on the sense we've made out of it. So this starts shaping a certain dimension of our inner consciousness. So we decide something and it goes unconscious and it goes someplace in our space or this energetic format where we are. And it's unconscious. So it still plays on what we're doing, thinking, how we see things, but we're unconscious of it. We become conscious when it reflects back. So a lot of the process of growth and learning is something happens, we reflect on it, it becomes a belief or a theory, and then we try it out. We see how what we've decided works. In other words, we test it out in life, and so either works or doesn't work, need modification. So there's that aspect. In that sense, perhaps all of our conscious living looks like a journey out here, but it's really a journey within. So life becomes a metaphor reflected back to us of our inner process. Well, so that gives us an interesting perspective. It also gives us an opportunity to gain some power with this when we start to consider that by mastering ourselves internally, we have a better access to managing our life outwardly. It changes how we see life, perceive life. We see more things. We see what's really going on, you see. Or we see things as something to bring greater awareness in ourselves. So then we begin to disidentify with the aspects of ourselves that we made up, so we're less reactive. We can go deeper into some deeper resource. So then we can turn also on this and look, well, what's the inner journey? What's the inner jihad? What's the inner quest, the internal journey up the mountain to the soul. So we turn inward and we begin to gain a sense that there's a geography to this. We organize things in certain ways, and they reflect into our body and the endocrine system, and they set off hormones and reactions and emotions come up. But they're all caused by this internal matrix of what we've decided about life and how we've shaped it. And there's also, of course, the genetic nature and the part of the aspect that comes down through our the consciousness of our ancestors that's also in play. And so we begin to discover our talents, our strengths in the process of living. And so most of us are pretty conscious of this aspect of it. So for this discussion, I want to focus more on that. What is that journey inward that takes us into our source, into our soul wisdom, and by so doing, shifts how we exist in the world. I drew our attention this time to Emerson's The American Scholar, because he so succinctly, over 100 years ago, stated a dilemma of how to create life in this world based on the soul consciousness, and the kind of forces in education that taught people to be unconscious of that. So I'm having us look at that and take a part of it and find our Emersons in our own culture. Like if you were in South Africa, it might be Mandela. If you were, in another part of the world, it might be somebody else. These individuals that somehow had tapped into this resource that they could see above the conditioning of the culture and become a transformative force in the culture. And that only comes to the soul connection. So the ancients in their schools, in their mystery schools, would start this inner process, and so the attention would go inward, and awareness would come. Aspects of oneself would awaken through this inner journey or meditative process, or however that frame is framed. And so they had, you would come across this encounter that would challenge you, because the survival pretty much will defend what you believe you are. So as we turn inward, we encounter resistance. We encounter an internal challenge or adversary. And one of the ways they conceptualized this was the dweller on the threshold. In other words, to get past this gate into this deeper consciousness, you had to deal with this being that would encounter you. Well, all that being was a composite of all the dark deeds, like anything you'd ever judged yourself for, been ashamed of, cheated on, been dishonest, denied your soul, attached yourself to inner levels of power that were about, power in the world. We get attached to this, so this was a composite. Well, so it's kind of convenient if you could have a strong enough sense of who you were. You nurtured your loving enough, or nurtured your alignment enough to where when you met this opposition, you would not forget yourself, and you could pass through it. And by so doing, also, it would drop away the identity, part of your identity that was attached to maintaining this consciousness inside of you. Nowadays, we kind of chip away with it. What the Jungians call it shadow work. And one of the things we do is we find a judgment where we made ourselves wrong, or judged ourselves, or decided we were in love, we go through this forgiveness process, and that deconstructs the limitation and the attachment to trauma, and that falls apart, so then the deeper health asserts itself again and transforms and brings loving into that area where the barrier or the defense, the reactiveness was. So we're always doing this in this process of transformational work. We're discovering these beliefs and forgiving ourselves. So in a sense, that's meeting the dweller. So that starts the inner journey. And then so they had a second dweller, which was considered more formidable than the initial one. And this was a composite of your all your good deeds, all the wonderful things you did for positive status in the world. Anything you did to prove yourself good by being good in the eyes of others. What a great person I am. Look at my power, look at my wealth, the acquiring of money. See, all these became the positive dweller. All the things that we thought we were good because we did good. So this is just as much a deception as the negative dweller. So this is a harder challenge, because here we may have good standing in the world through this, through how people see us outwardly. But the attachment of that is part of a reflection. It's part of the reflected self. So it's not sourced out of the essence of self. It's not sourced out of the soul. In a sense, life reflects back first the unconscious, and we can learn about ourselves through what's reflected back and made conscious. But there's also this soul drive through that we are, and we're in our lives and motivated from this deeper soul purpose to fulfill, to do things, to return back to our source. So this is an easy substitute sometimes for the soul. So it becomes internalized, and we come against this, and we start, this is my soul, this is my essence. But just another, perhaps you could look at it as a higher evolution of the ego. It's, I guess the highest form is it sees the great glory and light reflected back to it. It really, and think it's arrived at, this is it. And so I'm the guru, I'm God, I'm all-powerful, I'm the conqueror of nations, I'm the source of salvation for my people, I'm this, I'm that, So it's a little tougher to challenge this one, to forgive ourselves for making, our, the thing we see ourselves to be, or a substitute self, more important than the soul of self. See? So that's a bit more challenging, and so we begin to look at that and position ourselves. Saggiola talked about the call of the soul, and psychological problems that arise out of the call to soul. I'm not sure he phrased it quite like that, but you get the idea. So there's issues that have to do with just living well and coping in the world, and of course that's how we're building up our competency as a social being, as a world constructed being, and how to make our way. And so there's issues come up out of that, and that's one level. And they look very much like the things that arise when the soul calls, but what happens is there's this deeper energy that's the soul that starts to move for some reason. And so it starts to push and strain on these distorted beliefs, these protected traumas, these misidentifications, these identifications with power and domination. And the power and domination can go both ways. Either you gain power through being dominated, or you gain power through dominated. Same being. And so many of us are responding to issues that arise because something has happened to remind us, to cause the soul energy to move again. Often when people are in natural disasters, it's a deconstruction of all that's safe and ordinary, and that starts cracking the ego so that they have to rely on deeper resources. Some people do it by starting to rob stores and do this sort of thing and start forming their little independent gangs. Other people respond to a sense of service and a sense of how can we help. There's like the Occupy movement with Occupy Sandy. This formed this whole organization that really was much more effective at delivering services and what people needed, and this came out of that impulse, you see. And then there was things in New Orleans where things went negative, where people were robbing, where the police were being vigilantes, and real negative energy at first, and then finally it shifted, of course, and these more positive elements begin to take over. So in both cases it was the deconstruction of the normal base of the society begin the transformational process, because that's what will emerge. So that's those two dimensions of the dweller. And so then there's a third element. So what we're looking for on this journey within is using these forces to discover our essence, or our soul, and identifying with that and bringing that forward. And so that is challenging in itself, because the first sense of that is often a sense of nothing. And of course that's very frightening to the basic self, or our ego self, because that's equivalent to annihilation. That's what keeps us moving here. So we really have to be careful with this, in a sense of there's natural proper functions here that have a place to play in our being effective here, in our survival, in our evolution, in the evolution of our genetic nature, our mental nature, our physical nature. So you can't do good and bad here. You can't say that the magnetic characteristic, well, in terms of the dweller model, the good guys and the bad guys inside that make up this magnetic dialogue that then outpictures into the world of like, us against the world, or for against, or adversaries, or even the positive movements that make an enemy out of the Wall Street or the racist, and then polarize against that. There's all that magnetic action, and then the personal charisma that we build up that does have power to it, or the magnetization of money that has power in it. See, that all becomes very important, but it's all constructed out of these various forces of our being. So in the soul activation, we're really bringing a third player to it consciously. First it's unconscious, then we bring it forward consciously. And the first sense of that can often be nothing. So if we've done our work and been, seeking our loving and opening that up in a deeper way, we have some sense of self that's going to exist in the nothing. There's a sense of self. So the loving sense of self, the sense of self as loving, will still have a reference point in the no reference points, in the nothingness. So then this is a step into that world where, is of essence, is of truth, is of soul. And that level of consciousness, we have access to everything. Like when Emerson talks about, within you is all wisdom, all knowledge. See, this is the nature of the soul. So in the American Scholar address, he so well describes, this is the nature of the soul, and this is what we're awakening for. And from this, we're drawing our inspiration for establishing things in the world. See, so the measure of things becomes that essence. And that's a shift from the measure of things being the control or power or safety, security, in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of the world. So the journey within is a path inward to this essence. And so it means a looking at everything inside to reevaluate it. Ever fear, ever limitation, ever block inside is arrested development. In other words, it's a positive energy in it that's been caught in a misunderstanding, in a sense. So it may be frightening at first, or painful at first, embarrassing at first. But in the deconstructing of it, it liberates the soul energy that was trapped there. So that brings awareness or consciousness into that place, so it can't be corrupted anymore. So that's the process. And we use a lot of ways to do this. The dialogue with each other itself will do it. The introspection, the inner journeying, the taking advantage of our reactions to things in the world, like, hey, then we have a reaction or judgment to in the world points to something we need to resolve inside. Keeping in mind, of course, that it really may be screwed up or off or distorted in the world. However, the journey within is to build a relationship with that, so the negativity in the world no longer defines how we stand in ourselves. So in a sense, we're talking about being a spiritual warrior here, or a transformational leader or teacher. See, that's the shift. So that the challenges we engage in the world, we first use to resolve the issue inside of us. And then we're able to bring forward some kind of response from the soul, from the all wisdom, to the situation, rather than just trying to fix it or manipulate it through our reaction to it. See, so it changes our center of gravity, it changes how we're lined up and how we organize our response to things. And essential to this is there's no good and bad here. There's our use of it. So we're always building whatever we encounter, inwardly or outwardly. We're always bringing into a greater alignment with the loving. And that loving is our truth, our self. And the ways we reverse that loving are the elements of the false self, or the I know this is kind of maddening to the mind, because we build this false self as a vehicle to live life through it, but that's a positive thing. However, it's a limited self, and so it's negative in that sense. So we have to go to a deeper level of intelligence than just our mentality or intellect, or we can't really put this together and stand in it in a way. We can't even make the intellectual or the mind or the materialist a bad guy. See, we've got to say, well, that's playing a part here. How can I stand with this and look for how things are working and start to create a synergy out of what's working within me and around me and in the world, and form a synergy that way, because that'll start converting the areas of limitation or negativity that exist in my life. So, are you ready for the inner journey? It leads to the promised land. And in discovering that within yourself, you gain the perspective and the resources and the support and the allies with which to manifest that in the world. So, welcome to the challenge within.